So the United States is now in an armed conflict with drug cartels, which opens the door to more airstrikes, special operations raids, even the possibility of boots on the ground in Venezuela. So diving into what we know, and we're already seeing this play out today. Just a few moments ago, Secretary Hegseth released this video showing another strike against cartel boats in the Caribbean, where he said, quote, "Earlier this morning, on President Trump's orders, I directed a lethal kinetic strike on a narco-trafficking vessel affiliated with designated terrorist organizations in the Southcom area of responsibility. 4 male narco-terrorists aboard the vessel were killed in the strike, and no U.S. forces were harmed in the operation. The strike was conducted in international waters just off the coast of Venezuela while the vessel was transporting substantial amounts of narcotics, headed to America to poison our people. Our intelligence, without a doubt, confirmed that this vessel was trafficking narcotics. The people on board were narco-terrorists, and they were operating on a known narco-trafficking transit route. These strikes will continue until the attacks on the American people are over." And there's a couple key points in there that we need to pay attention to. First off, he does not name the terrorist organization, and there are a couple that we've now named in Venezuela, Tren de Aragua and the Cartel of the Suns. Those are different organizations, and that's going to be really important here in a minute. We also they're referring to these attacks on the American people. These strikes will continue until the attacks on the American people are over. A lot of the pushback we've seen since these operations in Southcom have begun is the legal pushback of what is the justification, what is the authorization for carrying these out. And we've covered it in multiple videos, and it generally falls into 2 camps. You have self-defense. That's easy. If U.S. troops are getting shot at around the world, they have the authority to defend themselves. But that doesn't appear to be the case, especially when you've got a drone striking maybe unarmed boat. Doesn't matter if it's unarmed or not. It's not shooting at the drone, right? Or at U.S. forces. So self-defense doesn't really seem to be on the table, and nobody's even claiming that for what it's worth. The second is that if we're engaged in an armed conflict, and up until last night, we were not. You can argue all day that what the cartels are doing is bad and that it's a detriment to the United States and is dangerous and is killing American citizens. Got it. We were not in an armed conflict with them. So there was no justification for the use of lethal force. Simply naming an entity a foreign terror organization does not open the door to be able to kill them. There's more to it than that. But if we're in an armed conflict, that changes things. And just last night, President Trump the reporting came out that President Trump had informed Congress that we are now in an armed conflict with cartels. So this kind of provides the justification now. The New York Times article says the Trump administration informed Congress in a confidential notice that the president has determined the United States is in an armed conflict with drug cartels and that members of the organizations can be targeted as unlawful combatants. Citing the notice, they say, quote, "The president determined these cartels are non-state armed groups, designated them as terrorist organizations, and determined that their actions constitute an armed attack against the United States. In response, based on the cumulative effects of these hostile acts against the citizens and interests of the United States and friendly foreign nations, the president determined that the United States is in a non-international armed conflict with these designated terrorist organizations." This is going to get some questioning, no doubt. So essentially what they're saying and why it's so important that Secretary Hegseth in his statement there said these strikes are going to continue until the attacks on the American people are over. They are referring to drugs coming into the United States as an attack on the American people. The framing of that is really important here. We haven't really seen that in the past. I don't know that there's a precedent for that. Generally, when we think of attacks, we think of bombs, gunfire, things, terrorist attacks, things like that. But that appears to be the route that the administration right now is framing this. And immediately, as expected, there is some pushback here. We have an expert on the law of armed conflict at Texas Tech University, Jeffrey Korn, said this justifies as a pretext to open the door to the extraordinary use of force. Quote, "What is the evidence that these groups are attacking the United States? This is not Pancho Villa riding across the border in Columbus, New Mexico, and attacking police stations." And I think he's right in the sense that there's going to be some requirement for the United States to explain, for the administration to explain why drug trafficking is viewed the same as attacks, like an attack on the American people. And I think one of the challenges they're going to run into is that same act inside of U.S. borders is treated with law enforcement and we arrest those people and prosecute them, I don't know exactly how they're going to make the legal argument that the same thing just happening not inside the United States is an attack and the use of lethal force is justified. That seems to be the direction where this argument is going to go. Now, there was an article that came out yesterday as well that I think was kind of stoking the fire unintentionally. I do think, and we will continue to talk about, what I think is an increased likelihood of military operations, maybe even boots on the ground in Venezuela. Not like this, though. Tom Rogan over in the Washington Examiner said, quote, "Indeed, the Washington Examiner understands that military planners believe the assembled forces are now sufficient to seize and hold key strategic facilities such as ports and airfields on Venezuelan territory." He says the Washington Examiner is withholding some details for national security reasons. U.S. control over such locations would allow for the increased, sustained projection of U.S. military power into Venezuela from defensible positions. Put simply, U.S. forces on and around Puerto Rico, the ground force centerpiece of which is a Marine infantry battalion, are now ready to launch territorial seizure operations on Venezuelan territory. I just don't think that's the next step here. In fact, let's pull up a graphic here from Ian Ellis, doing incredible work updating assets on station, and there's a lot here. And this is where the reporting kind of splits, right? We have way more on station than is needed to interdict the occasional drug boat, right? We've got 10 F-35s, 6+ Harriers, Reaper drones, Cobra attack helicopters, 4 guided missile destroyers, the Iwo Jima amphibious ready group, submarines, multiple Coast Guard cutters, and just as we reported in a couple videos ago, the MV Ocean Trader, which is some sort of like special ops mothership / command vessel, helicopter launch pad. I'm not even sure. Kind of interested in learning more about that one, to be honest. That's a lot. And it is magnitudes beyond what we've seen in any other counter-narcotic type operation. So for a long time, there's been indications that we are heading towards some sort of more formal, direct military engagement with the cartels or maybe the Venezuelan government. When I say that the next step here is unlikely to be a ground invasion and seizing of territory, is in the Washington Examiner piece there, they say we have sufficient forces to seize and hold key strategic facilities. When you look at Ian's graphic here, he does a good job of laying out in the bottom left the Marines that are a part of that amphibious ready group. It would be less than 2,000, around 1,600 that would be a part of that group going ashore. Again, our Marines are incredible. They're incredibly lethal. They're very adaptive. They can overcome a lot of obstacles. You can take a good chunk of territory with that. 1,600 Marines is not going to be enough to hold territory for a significant period of time without bringing in substantial reinforcements. And those just aren't there right now. So 1,600 Marines should not be viewed as a viable force to take an airfield in a contested territory and hold it for any significant amount of time. There would have to be quite a bit following on behind that. Technically, we have those assets available in the United States. That's not too awful far from Venezuela. It would not take an awful lot to get at least a battalion of the 82nd Airborne in there pretty quickly that are on kind of ready status, and then some elements from maybe Ranger Regiment and others. But in terms of a large presence to actually hold some of this territory, it does not look like that is being assembled. Now, what does seem likely are increased strikes inside of Venezuela itself, maybe even against the Venezuelan regime and the Venezuelan military. Cesar Baez, a Venezuelan-based journalist, hit on all of this just earlier today, where he said, quote, "In the last 24 hours, 3 events have occurred that indicate an imminent escalation in U.S. action against the Cartel of the Suns." And a quick note there, when we go back to Secretary Hegseth's statement, he said that these strikes are being carried out against a designated terrorist organization in Southcom, of which there are a handful. One of them is the Cartel of the Suns. That is deeply intertwined, like one and the same in some cases as the Venezuelan government. That is a trafficking organization that Maduro and his allies say doesn't exist, but it's like organized crime within the government is a heavy, heavy part of that. Tren de Aragua, a term that I think a lot more Americans are familiar with now, that we have claimed recent drone strikes have been against, is much more separate from the Venezuelan government. There's some overlap there for sure, but when you say Cartel of the Suns, I mean, this is the one, for what it's worth, that the United States alleges that Maduro is the head of. There's no allegations that Maduro heads Tren de Aragua. The allegations are that he heads Cartel of the Suns. So when you have a Venezuelan journalist saying escalation is coming against the cartel of the Suns, escalation coming against Maduro and some of his top brass. Looking at his 3 events. 1, Trump informed Congress of his stance that the United States is now at war with the drug cartels, as the first article we covered today. 2, the White House does not rule out attacks within Venezuela. We talked about that in a previous video, and they've regularly been talking about how that is likely the next step. 3, Pedro Lopez, the defense minister in Venezuela, accused the United States of flying military aircraft near Venezuelan coasts. We're going to get into that and the details on that here in a second. Personally, the strikes inside of Venezuela make the most sense next. We have the intelligence capabilities to see where these boats are being loaded up at the dock. It would not be hard to see what trucks those are coming from and back those trucks to a supply facility, a depot where they're storing some of these drugs, probably even all the way back to where they're being produced in Colombia. Because that's generally the route that these take. So if we do want to step things up and move from the boats to something else, probably some Tomahawk strikes, probably Tomahawks now that we're getting more and more serious about this. Tomahawk's standoff strike capabilities fired from some of those guided missile destroyers in the Caribbean does not really put U.S. forces at risk. I mean, we have seen Venezuela does not have a robust air defense network, not by a long shot, but they do have an air defense network. So putting any sort of manned aircraft overhead does technically put our pilots at risk. Even a Reaper overhead. I mean, we saw the Houthis shoot down, 27 of those things in a few months' time. So those are vulnerable. They are not immune to modern air defenses. Venezuela has enough. They would be able to shoot down some Reapers, no doubt. So anything inside of Venezuela, probably expect TLAM strikes. Now, we are seeing an increase in manned aircraft flying close to Venezuela. Again, a lot of this, I think, has to be viewed under the idea of pressuring Maduro and seeing how much we can show him that we're serious. We're really going to do this and maybe get him to take some sort of action that he has not taken so far. Venezuela on Thursday criticized what it called an illegal incursion by U.S. fighter jets into an area under Venezuelan air traffic control, accusing Washington of a provocation that threatens national security. The Venezuelan government said U.S. fighter jets were detected 46 miles off their coastline. Defense Minister Lopez described the action as, quote, a military harassment and threat. He continued by saying they are imperialist combat planes that have dared to come close to the Venezuelan coast. The presence of these planes flying close to our Caribbean Sea is a vulgarity and a provocation, a threat to the security of the nation. We are watching them, and I want you to know that this does not intimidate us. It does not intimidate the people of Venezuela. So very similar language that we're seeing from some officials in Venezuela for quite a while now. We have seen an increase in kind of preparations for the possibility of going to war with the United States. And I think it's worth keeping this back in mind because a lot of the way that we are framing this here in the U.S., you saw Secretary Hegseth's statement a moment ago and President Trump last night, we're at war with the cartels. We're going after drug trafficking, narco, terrorist cartels. In Venezuela, they are viewing it as war with Venezuela. So there's a disconnect there. And this is one of those instances where it's important to understand that because they're going to be a party to this in some way, shape, or form if this continues. And for what it's worth, it's being presented as U.S. versus Venezuela, not U.S. versus some cartels that happen to have some association or even originate from Venezuela. Now, we are still seeing a lot of back and forth on the legality of these strikes. It sounds like just a couple days ago on Wednesday, the Senate Armed Services Committee received a classified briefing from the Pentagon General Counsel talking about the legal justification for these strikes. The responses were a little mixed. It sounds like we've got people still coming out saying we're not entirely clear. And they said Matthews the legal counsel refused to provide a written justification. So he's just kind of answering questions at this point. A couple different responses here. Senator Tim Kaine said, quote, I was there. I was not satisfied, adding that he and Senator Schiff planned to put together a war powers resolution to reassert congressional control over military action of this kind in the Caribbean. And I should note that's not happening anytime soon because as I record this on October 3rd, 2025, the government is shut down. So we are inching towards war or depending on how you look at it, President Trump last night saying we are at war now with the cartels and the government shut down. So that's probably going to get the focus here in the near term. These strikes or an increase in these strikes may very well go under the radar for quite a while. Senator Jack Reed, a Democrat, criticized the administration, saying there's no credible legal justification, evidence, or intelligence. Every American should be alarmed that their president has decided he can wage secret wars against anyone that he calls an enemy. And then some speaking out in favor here. Of course, we have the Pentagon spokesperson, Sean Parnell, said that all operations are lawful under both U.S. and international law, with all actions in complete compliance with the law of armed conflict. And then Senator Tom Cotton, a member of the Senate Armed Service Committee, said, quote, President Trump has every right under Article 2 of the Constitution to wage war against those who are waging war on the United States. These types of actions have been done many times by presidents of both parties. And I think an important part there is how we've seen the framing shift over the course of the last few weeks, really. Started out with Maduro is an illegitimate president. He's the head of a trafficking regime. And we saw it slowly shift to where it is today, where the combined effects of these drugs coming into the United States constitute an armed attack against the American people, therefore will be met with lethal force. So this is, in my opinion, probably going to escalate here in the near term. We're probably going to see more strikes on boats, and as the minute that those targets become harder to find, we're going to move inland and start hitting some of the facilities on shore. So be ready for it, because it's pretty clear that's the direction we're going. Now, for anyone interested, we do have a Patreon program. We just stood up last month, actually, relatively new. We've got ad-free, sponsor-free videos. We've got some Q&A with patrons. In fact, working on setting the next one up here in the next couple of days. That was really fun, because it was kind of like a lot more personal stuff and just kind of getting to chat more than diving into the news per se. But anyways, a big part of that is just supporting the work we do here. So if interested, that'll be linked in the description below. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.